All right, hey everyone. I really wish I could be there in person, but I would not miss the opportunity to speak at the PowerShell Global Summit for anything. I really appreciate the opportunity to be here, albeit remote, and I certainly appreciate you taking the time to come listen to what I have to say. And I hope that you mildly find it somewhat entertaining. Today we'll be talking about using PowerShell on Linux, specifically kind of getting started with it. When people think about PowerShell and they think about Linux, they typically don't think about the two going together. Well, I'm here to tell you that the two actually go together, almost like peanut butter and jelly, if you will. So let's jump right into it. A little bit about myself. I'm a principal incident response consultant at Mandiant. I'm also retired from the U.S. Army, where I did 20 years there. I started my career in information technology, enterprise services, and then I spent the latter half of my career doing cyber operations, everything from doing defense of the United States or Department of Defense network to being an offensive operator of the same. I did do 2 tours in Afghanistan. I was blown up there, and for my injuries, received a Purple Heart. Nonetheless, outside of that, I'm a cybersecurity adjunct professor where I teach PowerShell, Python, Linux, and digital forensics. Just really depends on the semester. And if I can give you a little bit of insider trader knowledge here, I actually enjoy teaching PowerShell more than anything else. Go figure. I'm a co-author of the PowerShell Conference Book Volume 2. I recognize that the volumes have continued on. I don't have to explain to you about the cause of why it's important. Some of you in the room may be recipients of that very cause right now. I do run some interactive PowerShell training sessions or platforms. I'll talk about those a little bit later in my talk. And I do have a presence out there on the interwebs for anybody who would love to connect. All right, that's enough about me. Let's jump into what we're here to talk about. I did have a very aggressive agenda. I had to slim it down. It's still pretty aggressive. We'll see if I slim it down too much. But what I found is when you're passionate about a subject, you really want to give everything you have for the subject, right? So it was like, oh, I want to tell them about this. Oh, I want to tell them about this as well. And the next thing you know, I'm like, I probably should have did a 90-minute session. So I ended up slimming it down some. All right, so getting into it about PowerShell. Well, some of you may be very fluent in the language. Other people are like, I'm hearing a lot about it, so I want to learn a little bit more. But nonetheless, let me baseline a little bit. Introduced in 2006, originally called Monad. It was implemented certainly as an engine. It could be embedded in a graphical user interface or used directly from a command line interface. Generally, when we think of the graphical user interface, we think of the integrated scripting engine. And then when we think of the CLI, the command line interface, we think of just straight up PowerShell.exe. In either case, either one of those are actually truly PowerShell, as you may know. It's all about the system.management.automation DLL of sorts. But nonetheless, it's an integrated command shell, almost like a command prompt if you're used to that. If you're a programmer at heart, it's very simplified, almost like C#. It's a remote management framework, so I can remotely manage my machines within my domain, whether it be from an IT perspective, if I want to do some type of defensive analysis, or even if I want to maliciously take over machines and have malicious logic actually run on those machines, I can utilize this remote management framework. It's built on top of the .NET framework, which is huge, right? This is Microsoft's original implementation that really supports running websites, services, desktop apps, and more on Windows. We pipe actual full objects. So as we get into some of this Linux-ism, if you're trying to essentially find data in, let's say, some text within Linux, generally you're using sed or awk or cut. And then if you were one digit off, you're like, oh, let me sed, cut, awk, cut, sed. We don't have to do all of that from a PowerShell perspective. When we think in terms of objects, we literally identify the object and understand the properties or attributes associated with the object, and we select those properties or attributes. This is great. The functionality utilized in PowerShell is extensible in terms of commandlets being essentially compiled.NET. functions being reusable chunks of codes. We can develop scripts. We can also integrate native commands within them. So if you're one of the types from a Windows perspective who loves to use find string, find str, you can incorporate that in PowerShell. Or if you're one of those who loves to use grep from a Linux perspective, you can also incorporate that in there as well. So you're not having to totally relearn everything new. You can use some old with the new. So cool, that's PowerShell, a little bit of history. Well, what about from a blue team perspective? How is this great? Well, it provides access to all the APIs available on Windows, so that speaks to the interoperability and extensibility of the language. We also have the ability to incorporate controls and logging mechanisms within it as well. It can also be used to track any abuse that one may be trying to use within our system, either from the perspective of logging things that aren't necessarily logged, or from the perspective of the enhanced logging that has certainly been a huge benefit in newer versions of Windows PowerShell. We have the ability to actually encrypt our traffic. As you could imagine, if I'm doing something from a defensive nature and I'm retrieving metadata and other attributes about certain things from the file system, I don't want to be slanging that around, for lack of better words, in the clear across my network. So being able to encrypt that is huge. And if you're in such an organization that doesn't have the funds to purchase the next generation defensive platform, you can also make of sorts a defensive platform utilizing PowerShell. So for all the things that makes it great from a defensive perspective, well, there's also a number of things that makes it great from a red team perspective. And some of the things that makes it great from a red team perspective are also on the blue side. Well, why is that the case? The same reason that I want to encrypt my traffic from a blue perspective is probably the same reason why I would want to encrypt my traffic from a red team perspective. I don't want anybody to be able to see that data. I want the integrity associated with it and the confidentiality as well to be intact. Now, from a red team perspective, we could also utilize it to avoid some detection mechanisms and bypass some of those things. And sadly enough, some organizations, they don't quite understand PowerShell just yet. And there's no, it may not be updated, right? When we talk in terms of Windows 7, well, who's still using Windows 7? I tell you, I do incident response in digital forensics, and a number of people are still using Windows 7 as if it just came out. So what does that mean? They have PowerShell version 2 there, and there is not any inherent security features that are built in, and these organizations aren't necessarily upgrading to the latest and greatest. That makes it great from a red team perspective. No security, red team field day, if you will. And guess what? If they do have a new version of PowerShell, they may not have things like transcription login enabled. They may not be using some other technology that certainly makes it worthwhile or protected, if you will. And I talked about being able to encrypt that traffic, and the same reason that utilizing APIs that are already built into Windows from a defense perspective are great. Also make it great from a red team perspective. The days in which I would be doing forensic analysis and seeing a red teamer, or in real life, if you will, a nation state actor or a malicious actor, bring in customized toolkits to a compromised machine, those are starting to become somewhat a little bit more far and few. They're utilizing things that are already there, right? I don't know about you, but when I go over to a friend's house and I ask, hey man, what do you need me to bring, right? If we're having a get together, and they say, Nando, don't bring anything, just show up. That's the red teamer. They're able to just show up, utilize PowerShell, and add access to the API ecosystem, if you will, without having to bring in some other aspects. Now, the red team aspect also has the ability to operate some of this code in such a way that it doesn't touch the file system. right? When you think of malicious activity or being able to highlight it, it's either a malicious thing is happening on the file system or it's happening in the context of memory. If it's happening in the context of memory, it's not touching disk, and that becomes a little bit more stealthier in nature. And because PowerShell is an interpreted language, meaning it's not compiled, then script-based attacks are great because while I'm not going to do it here, because we're going to focus more on Linux, when we look at AMSI, anti-malware scan interface, if you just type in literally Mimi cats, or if you type in some of security researchers, some of their names in the console, AMSI is blocking it, right? Because it's really signature based. So because of that, we now have the ability to essentially bypass it. Okay, if I type Mimicat straight out, you block it. But what happens when I do MI plus cats, right? Concatenate that all together. Oh, it works. Okay, cool. So it's a continuous cat and mouse chase in terms of that. Now, if that's not enough from a red team perspective, as we transition more into, well, what are we seeing at large? We go over to our friends at CISA, right? From their perspective, they do a number of assessments throughout the year. They are utilizing not a format. They're utilizing the MITRE attack framework, which really buckets different actions into different categories. So we have initial access, execution, privilege escalation, defense evasion, right? We have all these different categories. And what CISA's done is they've gone in there and said, hey, for the category of command and control, here's what I'm seeing in terms of what the actors are using, and they put a percentage associated with it. Now, in terms of execution, meaning they've gotten access and they're executing their malware or their malicious payload on the system, PowerShell from 2020 is at 24.4%. So we're almost talking a quarter of execution from engagements that CISA has been a part of. A quarter of the execution is PowerShell. That is huge. Some of my friends and colleagues or people in the world would tell us that PowerShell's days of being used from a cyber perspective are done. And I would tell you the proof is in the pudding, because a quarter of it seems to highlight that that's not necessarily the case. Now, if you're not a fan of CISA or you just want some other data to kind of help confirm this, well, the organization I work for, Mandiant, as you know, we do cybersecurity, forensics, incident response on some of the most, highly visible cases. Nonetheless, we produce a report called M-Trends. It's a yearly report. The M-Trends report just came out last week, and guess what? We also highlight something similar. So we highlight, what the top tier entity is for application layer protocols. We highlight top tier for command and scripting interpreters. We highlight the top tier for indicators, removal on host, and a number of other things. But guess what? For a command and scripting interpreter, PowerShell is top tier, 65%, right? This is huge. Now, in terms of that, we've highlighted why it's great from a defense perspective. We've highlighted why it's great from a offensive perspective, and from a system administrator perspective. You all already recognize that, and I'm not saying that because everybody in the room is a system administrator, but the language was built for system administrators. But we see how other entities are able to use it as well. There are a substantial amount of things that overlap in different categories, and then there's a substantial amount of uses that are specific to those entities. Now, for the things that start to overlap, that's where it gets gray from a cyber perspective, right? When somebody is running Git process, is it the system administrator that's trying to understand legitimately what processes are running on this system so he can troubleshoot? Is it the defensive person who's out there hunting doing reconnaissance, if you will, looking for a malicious threat actor? Is it the red teamer who gained access and is literally trying to look to understand if the organization is running some type of next gen threat detection platform, or they're trying to understand if somebody is actively logged into the system and doing something, right? It gets a little gray with that piece that's overreach. Now, if that's not enough to highlight that the language is of great use and is being used, you all know this, you're at the PowerShell Summit, right? But for others who may not, I highlight this. Red Monk, they have a quarterly thing that they produce, although the last one they produced has been third quarter of 2021. They highlight the number of projects on GitHub. They also highlight the number of tags on Stack Overflow, and then they show where languages stack up against that. And near the top, right, I see PowerShell. And if I were to count each one, it's like number 17. And I don't know about you, but I'm actually pretty ecstatic that it's up there like that. I showed my wife this and she's like, yeah, but you're not number one. I was like, oh, you're so negative, right? Like there's other languages that I would expect to be up there. C, C Sharp, Objective-C, right? JavaScript. I'm a computer science undergrad. My undergrad at the time was very Java focused. Python, like cool. We see some big heavy hitters up there, but guess what? We also see that PowerShell is above some other languages, and there's more languages that PowerShell is above than what there are of languages that are above PowerShell. And for me, I'm winning. I'm happy with 17 all day, every day, right? Now, we could always do better, but this certainly highlights that people use the language. And from a system administration, red team, and a blue team perspective. Outside of that, there's also a young fella that came up and developed a module to control his Tesla. Now, what was that? Oh, it doesn't work right now. Oh, gosh. Okay. Well, that's unfortunate because I was trying to get my wife to allow me to get a Tesla so I can test this. As you could imagine, yeah, it didn't work. It appears the code didn't work or does not work at the moment. However, it starts to highlight the interoperability, the extensibility associated with the language. The language is great. So that being said, and yes, I was serious about all of that. Let's jump really into the Linux aspect of this. Now, I would be remiss if I didn't give a disclaimer. Got to give a disclaimer with everything we do. And for some, it might be TLDR, too long, didn't read. And for others, it might be too small, couldn't read. So let me really just highlight what the cliff notes associated with this. I'm not saying PowerShell is the best language for every situation. I'm merely highlighting how powerful, go figure, how powerful the language is as a cross-platform language. And that is true. And I don't think anybody can certainly deny that. So getting into this, we have different versions of PowerShell. Obviously, there's PowerShell that's built into Windows. Windows PowerShell has reached its, I don't want to say end of life, but it's no longer being developed upon. And now what's being focused is PowerShell Core. That is the future. Unfortunately, PowerShell Core is not installed by default on any of these platforms. So what does that leave us to do? Well, if we're still using Windows, and I'm not saying like we should all be not using Windows, if you're on a Windows machine, you can install PowerShell Core. We're going to highlight how do we do that. You don't have to uninstall Windows PowerShell. You can actually have both of them on there side by side. If you're on some other machine, let's say Linux or Mac, and there's a number of other things, well, guess what? You can now bring PowerShell with you and you can install it there. So what is this whole PowerShell Core? Well, it was announced in 2016 and released in 2018, cross-platform in nature. So I, in theory, can develop code that will work in a Windows environment, but that also has the propensity or ability to work in a Linux environment. That is huge because I don't know about you all, but when I develop code, I don't have time to be developing multiple iterations of code for different platforms. So this is huge. Now, we don't get the full .NET here, we get core. So that's going to be a reduced variant of it. However, we still have some form of .NET classes that are exposed, albeit not the full number of them. When we're launching PowerShell Core, when we're doing that on Windows, pwsh.exe. When we're doing that on Mac and Linux, it's straight up pwsh. Now, I highlight that it's available on Windows, Mac, and Linux, but really what flavors of Linux? Well, if we were to navigate out to the GitHub for PowerShell, yes, there is a GitHub now for this stuff. We see the Windows, we see for Linux, we have Ubuntu, Debian, CentOS, RHEL, OpenSUSE, Fedora. We also see what we have for Mac OS, and we also see, in theory, Docker. Now, how do we go about getting this? Well, my opinion, Nando's opinion, we got three options to really get after this. Option one, I can jump on a system, open a web browser, navigate out to GitHub, manually download this, and install the package. And that picture is a picture of the GitHub there. Option two, there's a download script. So I can download the install script, and then I can execute it to download essentially the package. And when I do that, I can then manually install the package myself. Option three, well, I can use the one-liner by Steve Lee that will allow me to download it and auto install it. Now, in production or outside of what we're doing right now, I'm a YOLO type of person. So option three would be what I would steer towards. But for here, let's go ahead and use option two. So we're going to do a wget, i.e. An invoke web request equivalent. We're going to reach out, download this install-powershell.sh. Yeah, I know. Why are we using sh? Well, I got to use a little bit of bash, for example, to get me to PowerShell. So we download this install-powershell.sh. We then get to a point where we're going to execute it. So I do a word count on this, that's WC, and we can see how many characters are in there. I really want to highlight that this is fairly small in nature, so it isn't something that's incredibly huge. Now, we also have some options here by way of this script, is we could install essentially VS Code at the same time, right? Which is great. I'd recommend you use VS Code unless you're a diehard VI person. You're still cool with me, but why not just use VS Code? Probably a subject or talk for another day. Nonetheless, we have those options. Now, when we do this, we have to chmod it. We have to make the script executable. And of all the things that I can circle in red up there, that would be the first line, the line that I did not circle in red. We did a 777, very lazy of me. I just wanted to make it executable, readable, and all that across the board there. Now, once we change the permissions to make it executable, the area that I actually circled in red, we are going to utilize sudo. Essentially, we didn't have the right, so we're going to utilize some permissions that's been delegated to us to operate under the context of higher authorization, and we're going to install or execute that script to install PowerShell. Now, I include IDE, integrated development environment. In this case, that's going to be VS Code. So looking at it from an editor perspective, you could use VS Code, you could use VI, Vim, or any other text editor. Maybe from a Linux perspective, you like Mousepad or gedit or whatever. The good thing about it is it's like the honey badger. It does not care. Now, when we use VS Code, we can utilize the PowerShell extension, and we can start to make that look a little bit more like the ISC if that's your flavor. But nonetheless, we have options when it comes to the editor in which we use. Executing commands. Well, the good thing here is we can actually call upon PWSH, as I mentioned, and then that drops us into essentially an interactive shell for a PowerShell. And you'll notice our prompt is changed. This looks eerily familiar from any other time we're in PowerShell, regardless of it being Linux. And from there, I can start executing commands. In this case, I'll do git host. I'm looking to see what version of PowerShell I'm using. Cool. And then it drops me right back to a prompt where I can continue to type in these PowerShell commands. When I'm no longer being entertained in doing that, I can type exit and it will put me right back into my Linux or Bash shell, if you will, my terminal. And from here, I can still execute PowerShell commands without dropping straight into that interactive session, if you will, by just calling upon pwsh-command, and then I could specify the commands themselves. Now, when that's all said and done, I get that information back, but I'm not actually staying in a PowerShell session. It is spawn up, it executes, and then it actually terminates. So we have a couple of ways to be able to execute our commands here. Now, here's a couple of things in terms of gotchas, right? And my mom says I learned things the hard way. I put my hand on the stove a number of times, and it just kind of hurt me a little bit as I went through and was learning these gotchas the hard way. I'm trying to save you a little bit of time here. So it is not case sensitive until it is, right? So because PowerShell doesn't care, the honey badger, there's items that we're still utilizing and calling upon within the Linux ecosystem that absolutely is case sensitive. So we want to be cognizant of that. Some aliases are not declared, right? So when we were using PowerShell on Windows and we did an ls, we're like, ls, right? And we know that's a get child item. Well, in Linux, ls is an actual command, right? And it is not an alias for get child item within the platform. So we just have to be cognizant of that. Like if we really gotten used to calling upon, let's say ls or straight up ps, well, those things in Linux actually have true meaning and actually do something. There are less commandlets available. So approximately 274-ish on the CentOS box that I was working on. That's a stark difference. I'm sorry? Okay, that's a stark difference from on V7 on Windows, where roughly we're talking 5,000 and some change. Okay, so the commandlets aren't there in its entirety, but they are being worked on an everyday basis. Some other things to know, a good thing actually, being able to do PSRemoting to a Linux machine, from a Linux machine, vice versa to Windows. That's actually being done over SSH. From an offense perspective, I'll talk about some extensibility outside of being able to do that via SSH. No WMI, no CIM. We recognize that the long-term solution is going to be open management infrastructure. So if you're one that's really become accustomed to being able to use those and the classes that are available, we don't have that in this current juncture on Linux. However, a good thing is the commands can be blended. So I mentioned that early on. So if you're one of those that just can't stay away from grep, you can pipe whatever it is that you're looking at to grep and go about your merry way. One thing that I like to do when I'm talking to folks about getting started in PowerShell, I'm an avid believer that the help files are bar none, right? Much better than man pages will ever be, in my opinion, in Linux. Well, that's unfortunate because on the Linux side, in terms of PowerShell, the help documentation isn't fully there, right? It needs some work. You can clearly tell that over time in the Windows side, the documentation has just gotten better and better. And from the Linux side, you can just tell that we're at the infancy of that whole thing. Now, the other thing, and this pained me, I love Outgrid View. Man, I love Outgrid View. And with PowerShell Core, it's no longer a thing. So that hurt me to the core. If you're not familiar with Outgrid View, I got a little snippet there in the bottom right-hand corner. An Excel-like pop-out graphical interface just allowed me, from a cyber perspective, to be able to slice and dice data on the fly. The other thing, right, when we look at PSDrives in Windows, right, those drives are listed and there's a number of providers and drives that are available. Conversely, when we look at the drives associated with Linux, well, there's less of them. So some of it's understandable just based upon the Linux ecosystem. But again, like for example, there's no registry in Linux, so we wouldn't expect that to be there. But again, if you become accustomed to certain aspects already being mapped out because of the providers within PSDrives, then you just want to be cognizant of that. Now, on the plus side, there is logging that is available within PowerShell Core on Linux. It is informationally, it is enabled by default, but if you want to get a little bit more verbose than that, well, there's a PowerShell.config.json file, and I post a location there. We would need to be able to create the file if it doesn't already exist, and then we can certainly array it in such a way where we can get much more verbose data from it. All right, and from a Linux perspective, depending on the flavor, the outcome or the logs associated with that will either get written to messages or secure from a Red Hat perspective, or syslog or auth log, right? So they'll just already get added to logs that we already have available, as opposed to a brand new PowerShell log being created. So this is good in the sense of if you're already piping those logs off to a log aggregation system, well, you're now going to be able to get that enriched information so long as you make that configuration change there. The great thing about PowerShell, object-oriented. So I can take flat logs like this secure log that I utilize cat to read, and I no longer find myself where I have to sed, awk, cut, and then grep to be able to get the data that I care about in there. I can utilize a couple of lines of PowerShell. I can turn that whole thing into an object, and then I can get the actual properties or attributes that I care about. Now, although you don't see the code here, I post that code on my GitHub, right? So you can quickly be able to convert this to an object and then get that information that you care about. This is great because it's easier for us to manage, it's easier for us to manipulate, and it's certainly easier for us to store. It helps us to be able to solve problems because we're not wasting so much time trying to awk, sed, cut, because the same way that you said awk, cut, and I keep saying it in different orders because that's what it feels like. You are chaining together different things that allow you to manipulate data, and guess what? It works for the thing that you want at that moment, and then you find yourself having to do something a little bit different for the next thing that you want. You know, we don't got to do that on the PowerShell side. We're able to utilize the object-orientedness, grab the properties that we care about, and grab that data that we care about as well. Now, I say that loosely because something like this, where we do PS for processes and then ops, a number of switches associated with it, we can loosely match that as well. So if we wanted to be able to see specific data that we're already accustomed to from a Linux perspective, we can match that. So I call upon PS aux, I can get that same data. Now, doing so in PowerShell requires me to do a little bit more coding, where I call upon get process. We then select the very objects that we care about. So we're able to see it in the same way as well. Conversely, we see PS aux, the image up top, gives us a very set of data and properties. And again, I tried to match that on the image below. But maybe I don't need all those properties. Maybe I just need a small subset. For example, maybe I just want to get the process ID associated with the process, the PID in this case. Well, for me to do just that in Linux, I have at least 4 different ways that I can do that. And I'm sure if I was giving out prizes right now, we could all go around the room and develop or highlight a different way that we could achieve that same result. What that really highlights to me is it's too cumbersome and too convoluted. I want to be able to get the object, select the very property associated with it. So if I want to get the ID, essentially the PID, we could get process, pipe that to select object, and I'll specify the name property as well, just so I don't have integers sitting up there on the screen. But we can do name, comma, ID, and be good to go. And the next time we want to get the PID, we can do the exact same thing. Well, we want to get a different property. Well, we just specify that property. We don't have to sit there and try to cut or set our way down to find the data that we absolutely are looking for. Yes. So to your question, yes, I want to jump on the bandwagon for sure. And no, I don't have an actual config file that really talks about the PowerShell logging here. I just started very lowly taking different logs and parsing them. So yeah, if there's a group that's focused on that, yes, I would love to be a part of that initiative. Okay, awesome. So when we think in terms of a survey, whether it's I'm doing it from a defense perspective or an offensive perspective, these are generic tasks that are associated with the overall survey. And generally somebody does a survey because they want to understand what's going on a machine. The same way you would survey a location, you want to understand the state of the location and what's going on at the location. Three things that really stuck out to me that I wanted to achieve from a Linux perspective was being able to retrieve a list of services, installed packages, which we can think of as software, cron jobs, which we can think of as essentially scheduled tasks. So being able to do that, well, in the image in the top right, I have some Linux text that would allow me to do that. I call upon system control, list units, specify a type, no legend, all that stuff, and I get this flat text that's returned to the screen. I don't have time for that every time I want to do it. So I end up developing some code, again, from a GitHub perspective on GitHub that then converts all of those things to objects. So now when I want to know essentially the service name, I can specify the name and it gets me that data. The object aspect of it is shown in the image on the bottom there. Same thing from a installed software, going through taking the list of software that is resident on the machine, converting that to an image so we can, not an image, an object, so we can select the very quantity that we care about, or even select the specific attribute associated with it. Now, from a default perspective, no commandlet exists for this, although we do have a commandlet from a Windows perspective that allows us. So developing this code starts to get us in the plentifulness, if you will, of developing other commandlets. Same thing from a cron job perspective. Cron jobs in Linux are essentially like scheduled jobs. So us being able to do this starts to get us in such a place where we can read these things much more cleanly. What I should have put up there that I don't have up there is the default cron job file, right? So you can see that it looks like a line of data, and really not being able to understand what those items mean unless you just really look at cron jobs on a regular day, everyday basis. Being able to put those in such a way that really is helpful for us is really the key, because again, there's no commandlet that's built in, and this would be the equivalent to scheduled task in Windows. From a PowerShell over SSH perspective, this is going to require PowerShell Core 6 or higher. We can do Linux to Windows or Windows to Linux. There's a couple of caveats there associated with it. Traditionally, from a PowerShell remoting aspect, we think of 5985, 5986 as the ports by default. But since we're using SSH, that's all going to run over SSH. So we would utilize the PowerShell client. The PowerShell client would then pass it to OpenSSH or whatever that SSH client is. In the background as a subsystem, that SSH client would then be interacting with that SSH server, which would then transcribe, if you will, the standard input-output streams to actual PowerShell. And then with that data coming back the opposite way, then that communication is just reverse. From the perspective of getting outside of that, We can specify other types of clients. So SOCAT is thought upon in the offensive world as the Swiss Army knife, if you will, of capabilities. So being able to plug and play SOCAT in there as well to be kind of like that underlying transport mechanism is great. So it still gives us that PowerShell remoting that a lot of us have been accustomed to, that we can now add into our Linux aspect as well. From a cross-platform perspective, what are the benefits? Now, I mentioned that I was in the military. I retired. For 20 years, I wore an Army uniform. Now I needed to have real clothes. Well, guess what? I'm going to go for the outfit that is dual purpose, right? So this guy, he's ready for business casual, happy hour. He's ready to go see his kids play soccer. He can do it all in that outfit, because from a cross-platform perspective, you're able to maximize our effectiveness, our productivity, our costs, all those things associated with it. There's also malware being developed from a cross-platform perspective. So I highlight 5 different malware types, whether it's a malware framework, crypto mining, where the actor was able to develop it one time and utilize it in Apple, Apple, Linux, and Windows. This is where we really start to see the benefit. Not saying you all would be out there developing malware in PowerShell. However, cross-platform is truly, truly great. That highlights, again, the language is cross-platform. We can write it once, use it many times. The language isn't necessarily on Linux where it's at from a Windows perspective, but it is certainly improving on an everyday basis, and it will be there before we know it. Again, you may not use PowerShell everywhere, but the environment will depict when and where you'll use PowerShell. All right, so in the last minute or so that I got here, now that we have highlighted PowerShell is great for Windows, it's great from a Linux perspective. We all now have the rings, and I want to give you a little bit more, right? So I present to you under the wire 75 interactive challenges from a PowerShell perspective, all focused on getting used to the language, the basics associated with the language. The way it works is each one of the games have 15 challenges. I'll present you with an actual challenge. I'll give you access to be able to SSH in. So in this case, the person's task is to get the build number associated with that version of PowerShell. They'll utilize that SSH connection, be able to do that. And then the answer there becomes the password for the next user, i.e. Sentry 2. There'll be a challenge for Sentry 2. That password becomes that answer becomes the password for Sentry 3, and then you'll continue on and on. Same thing for Posh Hunter. That's going to be focused on blue and red team activities, a little bit elevated from where we were in terms of getting started with the language. And then that brings me to the end. As you can tell near the end, I had to pipe it up a little bit. I think I have roughly about a minute. If there are any questions, certainly happy to answer them. If there's no questions, you can reach out to me on any one of these platforms. I'm a real person just like you. You start talking PowerShell, you got my attention for a bit of time. So I'll pause here, see if there's any questions across the room. Yeah, no, very good question. And unfortunately, I don't. The recommendation that I see is one of those things like if you build it, they will come, right? So if you keep using the current method that you have, it works. But there may not be anybody that comes behind and actually build it. So I don't know of anybody. However, if you're going to start something, I'll jump on that with you. So I don't know how to get it to you right now, but literally it's my first name dot last name at mandiant.com, or you can reach out to me on Twitter and then we can exchange emails there. Just a DM would work. Yeah, absolutely. Well, hey, I appreciate, again, the opportunity. Mike, I don't know if you're going to be on the same track that I have, but I'll be back Wednesday giving a talk. I can't wait to see all the videos once they get posted. All right, see you guys. Bye.